closer?
I just don't want to be in that video.
Okay. I'm thinking you can make cloth fit off. Like you see?
Yeah, like if they come up this. I mean, I don't mind. I just don't want to be in it.
Would the angle be too bad if you were up? Because I think it's a little bit more obvious that you're filming when you're higher up. So something to consider. I don't want people to I mean, hopefully when we but we can't be that confident.
Okay, I mean,
like if you were here.
I am Teresa Sanders, President and CEO of the Urban League of Long Island, and I welcome you all this morning. We're all excited about a real history lesson in terms of the groundwork that we've been doing in Nassau and Suffolk County. And equity is an issue, and we are just glad this morning that we have Mr. Roth here to talk to us in person about the color of law. And I want to thank my pal for years and years and years. Not that many years, we're still young. Widow Shea, resident of CDC Long Island. I do serve on the board of CDC, but Win and I go back several careers. And this is just another intersectionality of the work that we do on the ground here on Long Island. And I want to thank her for collaborating today and inviting me to be part of this. And our Solely team, which is the State of Black Long Island, just stand up and acknowledge that's the boots on the ground for the Urban League that's doing excellent work. Acknowledge them and thank them for all the work that they do. So, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce, for some of you, Ms. Widow.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all today. I have to be honest, when we talked about hosting this event here on the island, there was a part of me that was a little concerned about our turnout and how engaged would individuals be in this conversation. Not because of the quality of presentation that Richard brings. He is an educator and an advocate and a communicator like no other, and that will be validated in just a few minutes, but rather just because of the topic and the fact that we are part of the top 5th most segregated community on Long Island still today. And we're literally a stone's throw away from one of the communities that Richard talks about at length in his book, the community of Levittown. A community that when it was formed many years ago, while many people point to it as this wonderful success as the first established suburban community, it was a community that said whites only. And it wasn't only that the community said that, the government said it and literally required that. And Richard talks more specifically about that in his book to help us really understand not the perceptions, but the facts of how our communities were created. And I had the opportunity to hear Richard first speak thanks to NeighborWorks, and I think Eileen Anderson is here somewhere, thank you in the back, from NeighborWorks America. Over the summer, they had an executive symposium where they brought Richard out to speak, and as Richard is talking, I said, we got to get you to Long Island. And NeighborWorks does a tremendous amount in the space of race, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and charges executives and their organizations with looking through the lens and committing to the work to ensure that we are all doing proactively, collectively, right some of the wrongs of the past. And so when I asked Richard if he would come up to Long Island and he said yes, I thought of who is the most perfect person to partner with that we've been doing some of this work with thus far, and that of course was Teresa Sanders. Many of you know the work that she is doing at the Urban League and has been doing under the radar for an extremely long period of time, and really was the driver behind a report that is very much complementary to what Richard will talk about. And so when you look at the state of inequity for Black Long Island and the report that Teresa, with many of you in the room, supported and led in partnership with PolicyLink wrote, demonstrates accurately that we as a region leave $24 billion, not million, $24 billion on the table because of the racial inequities here on Long Island. And there is no reason for that to continue. So when I asked Teresa to partner, she said, of course, I would be more than happy to be part of collectively continuing to move the conversation. So I also want to thank our supporters who got us here today. JP Morgan Chase, unfortunately Deborah Johnson, who made this possible, is at another community development event with NeighborWorks today, and I want to thank Tricia Gleaton from our team, our VP of our Homeownership Counseling Center, who's been working feverishly to figure out how we can sort of take the conversation that Richard's having in this book and implement some of those changes and ideas right here on the island. You'll hear more about what we're doing in that space later on today. So sometimes timing is everything. You know, I got to meet Richard, talk with Teresa, and Richard was able to squeeze us in. And it's interesting that the day that you're here is the week that we lost really one of our most astute advocates and leaders and civil rights. I don't even have the words to describe Representative Cummings, but he was, I think, to all of us an inspiration. And I think the sort of last words that he left us with publicly, you know, when we're dancing with the angels, the question will be asked in 2019, what did we do to make sure we kept our democracy intact? And our democracy being intact, the foundation of that is our Constitution. And so Richard talks very much about how we have not adhered to those laws righteously for all of our community members, and we're just thrilled to have him here today to talk a little bit further with us about the color of law and the research that he's done. So before I invite Richard up, for those of you that haven't read the book yet, as I mentioned, there are copies outside. For those of you that have and have questions already percolating, what I'd like to ask you to do is you have no cards on the table. There are no cards and pens, and Teresa and I will facilitate the question and answer after. So if you have questions, like I said, that you already would like to present, please feel free to fill them out. If when Richard's speaking there are other questions that you have, please feel free to fill those out, and we'll collect them after, so we can have a really expedited conversation, because Richard does have to leave us promptly at 10:15. So, Richard, as many of you know, is a distinguished fellow. He is at the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the author of not only The Color of Law, but of Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right, Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Education Reforms to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, among many others. I want to just share two of quotes that have been provided about Richard's book to provide some greater context related to his comments today. The New York Times writes that one of the great strengths of Rothstein's account is the sheer weight of evidence he marshals. A research associate at the Economic Policy Institute, he quite simply demolishes the notion that government played a minor role in creating the racial ghettos that plagued our suburbs and inner cities. Going back to the 19th century, he uncovers a policy of de jure segregation in virtually every presidential administration, including those that we normally describe as liberal on domestic policies. At first glance, when he writes about Levittown, Levittown stands as a primary example of de jure segregation, which results from private activity as opposed to de jure segregation, which derives from government policy or law. Levitt, after all, appeared to be an independent businessman responding to the prejudices of the homeowners he hoped to attract. In truth, it wasn't that simple. As Richard contends in The Color of Law, a powerful and disturbing history of residential segregation in America, the government at all levels and in all branches abetted this injustice. We have created a caste system in this country with African Americans kept exploited and geographically separate by racially explicit government policies. Although most of these policies are now off the books, they have never been remedied and their effects endured. In his preface, Rothstein writes that America has a constitutional obligation to remedy these segregated practices in housing and that its story must be told. While the road forward is far from clear, there is no better history of the troubled journey than The Color of Law. Please join me in welcoming Richard Rothstein.
Thank you, Gwen. You took the words right out of my mouth. Since this book, well, actually before, for about the last 5 years, I've done nothing but travel around the country giving talks like this about the history of racial segregation. But this is the first time I've ever come home. I was raised in Flushing. I grew up in, I went to high school, Bayside High School. I know this area well. I may not look Asian, but in the 1940s, when I grew up, it was an Irish, Italian, and a few Jews living in Flushing. Well, some of you are old enough, most of you are old enough to remember that we had a civil rights movement in this country in the 20th century. It actually began, none of you are old enough to remember this, not even me. It began in the 1930s when civil rights lawyers thought that if judges were too out of it to understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in an inferior segregated law school. And then that precedent of abolishing segregation in law schools was used to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. That then went on to lead to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, which you're all familiar with, that prohibited legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And the Brown decision gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a nascent civil rights movement of activists who engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. Some lost their lives in that struggle. By the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had abolished segregation in everything from lunch counters to buses, interstate transportation, public accommodations, employment, swimming pools, water fountains. We came to understand, most of us in this country, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful not only to blacks but to whites as well, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. We came to all these understandings, and yet, at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all. The biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. How can it be that we came to this understanding that segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our pride in being a democratic society? How can it be we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, certainly it's hard to desegregate neighborhoods. If we abolish segregation in water fountains, the next day you drink from any water fountain. If you abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, myself included, you, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, we've adopted a rationalization, a national myth we tell ourselves is an excuse for leaving untouched the biggest segregation of all. And that myth goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges and schools and public accommodations and transportation, that was all done by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Civil rights violation. We are obligated to remedy it because it violated the Constitution. If the state and federal government, local governments were doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. also a civil rights violation, and we were obligated to remedy that as well. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, oh, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That just sort of happened. It happened by accident. It happened, maybe because bigoted white homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe we say, well, it was institutions in the private economy, businesses like banks, real estate agents, who discriminated in how they conducted their private business, not governmental action. Or maybe we tell ourselves, oh, it's just that blacks and whites like to live with each other of the same race. They feel more comfortable that way. If other race people move into our neighborhoods, we move. Or maybe we tell ourselves that it's really just an economic thing. It's income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and so they simply can't afford, so many of them can't afford to move to middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, non-governmental, private economic factors is what's created residential segregation. And we say, it's too bad. Most of us don't much like it. But there's nothing we can do about it if it's not a civil rights violation, if it wasn't created by government. We're powerless to do anything about it. What happened by accident has to unhappen by accident. Well, that's, as I say, the view of all of us. We give a name to this myth. We say that what we've got in this country is de facto segregation. Not apartheid like they had in other places. We just have de facto segregation, something that just sort of happened. Well, I spent most of my time, Gwen described some of the previous work I did, not studying housing policy, but education. I really knew nothing much about housing until just a few years ago. And in the 2000s, 1990s, early 2000s to 1990s, I spent much of my time, I was the education columnist at the New York Times for a while, some of you may remember that. And I spent much of my time denouncing the dominant education policy in the country at the time, in those 2 decades. And the education policy was something like this. It said that, oh, we have a terrible problem with the achievement gap between black and white children. And the reason we have an achievement gap is because teachers have low expectations of black children. They just don't try hard enough when they see black faces in their classrooms. And the way to close the achievement gap is to hold teachers accountable for higher expectations. And if we do that, we test children more and hold teachers accountable for their test scores, the achievement gap will disappear. I regard this as a ludicrous theory. And it turned out to be, of course, totally fallacious, but it was shared across the political spectrum. In 2001, you may remember, we passed a law called No Child Left Behind. It was sponsored by Republican President George Bush. In the Senate, it was sponsored by the most liberal Democrat, Ted Kennedy. In the House, it was sponsored by the most liberal Democrat, George Miller. This was the national consensus that this was the way to close the achievement gap. And I tried to explain in the columns I was writing, the books I was writing, that that's not the reason we have an achievement gap. Of course, some teachers have low expectations, but that's not the reason we have an achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many African-American children come to school with such serious social and economic disadvantages that expecting them to achieve at high levels is unreal. And I remember writing one column about asthma. Now, many of you know, I'm sure, that in urban areas in this country, in New York and elsewhere, African-American children have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. If they have asthma, they might be up at night wheezing. If they're up at night wheezing, they might come to school the next day drowsy, sleepless, maybe even not even come to school at all. And I tried to explain that if you have 2 groups of children, identical groups of children, you just divide that group of children randomly into 2 groups, and each group has the same racial breakdown, the same social and economic background, the same family structure, but one group has a slightly higher average rate of asthma than the other. That group's going to have lower average achievement, simply because testing them more often is not going to make them wide awake if they're coming to school drowsy. And I wrote column after column about the kinds of assaults that so many children come to school with, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. And each of these contributes to the achievement gap. That's the main reason why we have an achievement gap between black and white children. Well, So I say, this is what I was writing about. I'm a pretty slow learner. Take me a while to figure things out, but after a while I realized there's one thing if a child comes to school with either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. But what happens when you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or chronic economic insecurity or some other economic disadvantage like that? How can that school ever be expected to achieve at the same level of the school where children come to school well-rested, healthy, in secure homes? You can't expect the school to have equal achievement like that. Well, we call those schools segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today in this country than they ever have been in the last 50 years. They're more segregated. It took me a while to figure this out. They're more segregated today than they have been in the last 50 years because our neighborhoods are segregated. These schools are located in segregated neighborhoods. So it gradually dawned on me that housing policy was an educational issue, not just a housing issue. Well, I was thinking about this, and then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated the policies of two school districts, Louisville, Seattle, and Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both school districts had very, very trivial school desegregation plans, trying to address the issues I was just talking about. They were trivial plans. Both of them gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend. But if the parent's choice was going, stop that. People collecting plates. Thanks. Thank you. If the parent's choice was going to further exacerbate segregation, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of the child who was going to help to minimize the segregation of the school. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, and there was one place left in the school, and both a black and a white child applied for it, the black child would be given some preference, because that child would help to desegregate the school. It's a trivial program. How often do you have a school with one place left and both a black and a white child applied for it? It's not exactly the kind of thing that's going to desegregate the schools in Seattle or Louisville. But there's a well-intentioned idea. The Supreme Court evaluated that program, denounced it, said it couldn't be done. It was a violation of the Constitution to do this. And Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion, the controlling opinion. He explained that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated indeed. He said they were segregated because the neighborhoods in which the schools were located were segregated. I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That's the same conclusion I had come to. And then he went on to explain that the reason that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle were segregated was because of private choice. Because bigoted homeowners wouldn't sell to white families, or landlords wouldn't, or to black families, or landlords wouldn't rent to them, or private economic activity, or self-choice, or income differences, all things that I just described to you. And he said, we have that kind of de facto segregation that wasn't created by governments as a violation of the Constitution for the government to fix it. Well, I read that decision, and as I was reading it, I remembered hearing about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, some years before. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively. He had an African-American friend renting an apartment in the city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a middle-class job, had a wife and daughter. He wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in that suburb and sold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Somehow the police couldn't stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home, and somehow the police couldn't stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the courts, the entire criminal justice system are working to make sure that African Americans can't live in neighborhoods where whites live. As I looked into it further, I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of these cases, not a few, many here in New York, of mob violence frequently protected by the police driving African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased in white neighborhoods. Hundreds and hundreds of them. In Chicago, in New York, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, everywhere in the country. Every one of them where the police was involved was a civil rights violation, a violation of the Constitution. Never been remedied. And then as I looked into it further, I found that it wasn't just the criminal justice system that was enforcing racial boundaries, but there were many, many racially explicit federal policies, state policies, local policies that created the racial segregation that we know. And without those federal, state, and local policies, all of them violations of the Constitution, we would not have the segregation that we have in this country today. So in the few minutes I have this morning, I want to describe to you some of the chief federal policies. I can't go into very many of them, but I'll describe a couple of them that created the segregation that we're so familiar with today. One I'll talk about is public housing. Many of you, I know, think you know what public housing is, as I thought I knew. We think of public housing as a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children. Lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy. Getting involved perhaps in confrontations with the police. That's not how public housing began in this country. The first public housing in this country was built in the New Deal by the Roosevelt administration during the Depression. It was not for poor people. You had to be able to pay the full cost of your rent. To live in public housing, we had a high unemployment rate in the Depression, as you all know. It was 25% unemployment. Public housing was for the 75% who had jobs. The Public Works Administration was the first New Deal agency, and it built the first civilian housing in this country, civilian public housing in this country, and everywhere it built it, it segregated it. Separate projects for blacks, separate projects for whites, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. That may surprise you. But we had many, many more integrated working class neighborhoods in the early 20th century than we have today. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to that time to see the extent of integration there was. And if you think about it, you realize it had to be. We were a manufacturing economy at that time. Factories. None of this internet stuff that we do today. It was all factories. And the factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals in order to get their parts and ship their final products. So all the factories were located in a central district. And if the factory district had both African American and white workers in it, they all had to live close enough to be able to walk to work. They weren't driving in from the suburbs, maybe take short streetcar rides or subway rides, but they all lived close by. So we had integrated neighborhoods. Many of them, not all, but many integrated neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration segregated those neighborhoods wherever it went to build public housing. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright, you may be familiar with him, Langston Hughes. I hope you are.
Yes.
He wrote in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. It's what you would expect in an integrated high school, in an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Cleveland, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for blacks and one for whites, creating a segregation pattern there, and with other projects equally segregated and built elsewhere in Cleveland, a pattern that exists to this day. I've described a few other examples of these in the book, The Color of Law. I like to pick where I can on places that are smug and self-satisfied. I think they're better than everybody else. So, one of them, perhaps you've heard of, is Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, called the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half black and half white. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and built two separate projects in Cambridge, Massachusetts, one for blacks, one for whites. And with other projects like that, equally segregated throughout the Boston metropolitan area, created the segregation that we know in that area today. During World War II, the federal government government's policy of creating segregation intensified because then there were hundreds of thousands of workers who flocked to centers of war production, war factories, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. If the government wanted the planes and the tanks and the jeeps and the aircraft carriers and the ships to be produced, it had to somehow find housing for these workers. They were coming from small towns and rural areas. They were overwhelming the cities where these war factories existed. And the government did. It built war housing all over the country for war workers, everywhere segregating it, creating segregation that hadn't previously existed in many of these places. And a good example of that is the West Coast. Because if you know much about the history of migration of African Americans from the former slave-holding states to the rest of the country, you know that very few had migrated to the West Coast prior to World War II. They had migrated to New York and Chicago and Detroit during World War I. But World War II was the first time that significant numbers of African Americans migrated to the West Coast. So in San Francisco, where there were lots of shipbuilding going on, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers. 4 of them were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans in the neighborhood you may have heard of called the Fillmore District. And this was not self-choice. It's not that African Americans liked the name Fillmore, so that's where they decided they wanted to live. Whites liked the other names. This was an explicit federal program to create segregation in San Francisco where it hadn't previously existed. And the same thing was done in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast. When we have segregation today on the West Coast, which we do very rigidly, it's all because of these federal programs. There was no incipient segregation before World War II. After World War II, we still had a big housing shortage in this country, even bigger. There was no private economic activity going on during the Depression. There were a few of those public projects that I mentioned that built housing. During the war, it was against the law to use construction materials for civilian purposes. It could only be used for war workers in war plants. And then after the war, hundreds of thousands of returning veterans came home, needing housing, forming families. Some of you are the product of those families, the baby boom. They needed housing. There was no housing available. These weren't poor people. They had jobs in the post-war boom. They were returning war veterans, black and white, needing housing. They were living in Quonset huts and open fields, doubled, tripled up with relatives. We had a housing crisis then like we have today. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, had to respond to that housing crisis. He did so by proposing a vast expansion of the nation's public housing program. And remember, public housing was not for poor people. We're talking about public housing, good housing, the most desirable housing available that people paid the full cost of in their rent for working class families. He proposed a vast expansion. Conservatives in Congress, maybe some of you may remember his name, the leading conservative was a senator from Ohio. He was called Mr. Conservative, Senator Robert Taft. They opposed the expansion of public housing that Truman had wanted. Not for racial reasons, it was always segregated, they were happy with that. And not for, because they didn't like poor people, it wasn't for poor people, it was for people who paid rent. They opposed it because they said that public housing was socialistic. The government shouldn't be building housing for the returning war veterans. It should be the private sector, even though the private sector wasn't doing it. And so they came up with a strategy to defeat Truman's expansion of public housing. And it's something that observers of politics call a poison pill strategy. Some of you may have heard the term. A poison pill strategy is where opponents in Congress, opponents of a bill in Congress, propose an amendment called the poison pill amendment, which they think can get a majority. It's got majority support. And the amendment passes. And then when the full bill comes up on the floor of the House and Senate, with this amendment now attached, a different majority finds the bill objectionable because of that amendment. So the bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act along the following lines. They said, the amendment said, from now on, no more racial discrimination in public housing. It's the end of the segregated public housing business. If we're going to build public housing, it has to be on a non-discriminatory basis. Of course, it was a cynical amendment proposal. They didn't want public housing at all. But they planned to vote for this amendment. They thought they'd get some northern liberals to vote with them for the amendment. That would create a majority. The amendment would then pass. And then when the full bill came up on the floor of the House and Senate, requiring non-discrimination, non-racial discrimination in the assignment of public housing units, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats, who were all in favor of segregated housing in the South, but not in integrated housing. And so that would create a new majority, and the bill would go down to defeat. So liberals in Congress have to decide what to do. And I hope you listen carefully, I know you are, not to go into some detail about this story, because it's exactly the same dilemma that you face today. Exactly the same dilemma that you face today. They had to decide, were they going to support the integration amendment, with the result that no public housing would be built and not address the housing crisis which they were committed to solve? Or were they going to oppose the integration amendment against their principles in order to build more housing, though on a segregated basis? That was the dilemma they faced. Not an easy one. I don't know how you would have voted at that time. The leading liberal at the Senate, in the Senate at that time, was a senator from Illinois. His name was Paul Douglas. He had a close colleague, whose name I'm sure you'll remember. He was called Mr. Civil Rights, a senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey. They decided to campaign against the integration amendment. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and made a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the integration amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the integration amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, he persuaded his liberal colleagues to vote against the integration amendment. It was defeated. The full housing bill was passed as an ongoing segregated program. The federal government used that vote in Congress as its justification for continuing to segregate all housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 15 years, taking us into pretty recent times. I'm not sure that Senator Douglas, well-intentioned though he was right that we're better off, even though by that vote, even though it would have resulted in the intensification of a desperate housing crisis. Because as a result of that vote, we not only got the achievement gap in schools that comes about from the concentration of disadvantaged children in single neighborhoods, which was intensified so much by subsequent public housing construction, but we got the health disparities between African Americans and whites, because so many African Americans live in such more polluted neighborhoods with less access to fresh food, shorter life expectancies, greater rates of heart disease as a result. Another result of that vote was the mass incarceration crisis that we are so aware of today and so horrified by, which couldn't exist if we weren't concentrated in the most disadvantaged single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or the transportation even to get to them in most places. Another result, which is even more frightening to me, and I think to you, is the very, very dangerous political polarization that we have in this country, which seems to be growing. It's entirely a racial political polarization that tracks racial lines heavily, as you all know. I mean, how can we ever expect to develop or maintain the common national identity that's essential to the preservation of this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to identify with each other, no ability to empathize with each other's life experiences? Well, those are some of the consequences, some of the ways in which we weren't better off as a result of the continued segregation of housing as a result of that act. And under that act, the vast expansion of public housing that we're familiar with in this country took place. Here in New York, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, everywhere. The most famous of these probably the Pruitt-Igoe Towers in St. Louis. Maybe some of you remember seeing them. It was actually two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans, Igoe was for whites. Not because, as I say, self-choice. This is how they were assigned on a racial basis by the federal and local governments. Well, very soon after this vast expansion of public housing took place on a segregated basis, a development occurred that was quite surprising to policymakers and to housing experts. All of a sudden, large numbers of vacancies occurred in the white projects. Long waiting lists in the black projects. Soon, even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation where some of his projects were half empty and the others had long waiting lists. So at about this time, we're talking the mid-20th century, late 1940s, early 1950s, all the projects were opened up to African Americans. Soon they became predominantly an African American institution. At about the same time, we're talking again the late 1940s, early 1950s, the factories that I talked about before that had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals moved out to rural areas, suburban areas. Highways were being built. They no longer needed to get their parts and ship their final products by rail or by boat. They could use trucks. Good jobs disappeared from urban areas. So the African Americans who were now living in mostly in public housing, most of the public housing was African American and in other apartments, no longer had access to good jobs. They became poorer and poorer. As a result, they could no longer pay the full cost of housing and their rent, which had been a characteristic of public housing up until that time. Government began subsidizing it. Once government began subsidizing it, it became a welfare program. Government stopped investing in the projects. They began to deteriorate. And we got the kinds of urban slums that we associate with public housing today. That's now not how it began. But the question, I hope, is in your minds, or if you've read my book, it's not a question anymore, is why did the vacancies develop in the white projects and not the black projects? And the reason for that was another federal program that was even more powerful in creating segregation in this country than the public housing program. And that was a racially explicit program of the federal government designed to move white working class families out of urban areas into single-family homes in those suburbs, like Shively and Louisville that I described before, that now ring every metropolitan area in the country. The suburbanization of this country that took place in the late 1940s and 1950s for working class families who then became middle class created a white noose around every metropolitan area in this country. It was a racially explicit program, and the best example is the one right here, Levittown, as you know. Levitt may have been a bigot. I mean, he was a bigot, I shouldn't say may have. William Levitt was a bigot. He didn't want to sell homes to African Americans. But if the federal government had told him that in order to build that project, he would have to sell on a non-discriminatory basis, he would have had no choice. Levitt went to bank after bank after bank trying to get a loan to buy the land and build the homes in Levittown. 17,000 homes. What bank is crazy enough to give somebody a loan to build 17,000 homes in one place for which he has no buyers? Especially when we weren't a suburban country at that time. The banks thought he was crazy. Who's going to live in a place like that? They'd rather stay in the city. He couldn't get a loan. The only way Levitt could get a loan was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting his plans, the design of the homes, the construction materials that would be used, the layout of the streets, and he had to make a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt, and I don't know if any of you live in Levittown, but look at your deeds, they're still there today, even required Levitt to put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a racially explicit federal policy. It wasn't perhaps a rogue bureaucrats at the Federal Housing Administration. The policy manual that the Federal Housing Administration used, distributed to appraisers all over the country, who had to evaluate the applications of developers in every metropolitan area to build suburban homes. The policy manual said you could not guarantee a bank loan for a developer who was going to sell to African Americans. The policy manual even went so far as to say you couldn't get a bank loan, you couldn't guarantee a federal guarantee of a bank loan for an all-white development that was going to be near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. And that's what the federal policy manual said. Where did this notion of de facto segregation come from? It's utter nonsense. Utter nonsense. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. The segregation of our nation was created by the federal and state and local governments in as unconstitutional a fashion as the segregation of schools or lunch counters or buses or water fountains or any of the other I don't say trivial, but more trivial segregations that we addressed in the 20th century. And we've never addressed this one, despite our obligation as American citizens who take our constitutional responsibilities seriously to do so. Well, what were the consequences of this second policy that I just mentioned? Say some of you may know Levittown. Levittown homes, when they were built, were about 750 square feet. Many people have remodeled them since then, but they were small, modest homes. They sold for about $8,000 in 1949, 1948. Today, in today's money, that's about $100,000. I don't know, you guys know this neighborhood better than I do. Can you buy a home in Levittown for $100,000 today? Of course not. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. And in some parts of the country, those homes sell for much more. Maybe some of you remember Pete Seeger sang a song about little boxes on the hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was about a development just about as large as Levittown, south of San Francisco. Also sold for about $10,000 a piece, with a federal guarantee and a requirement of African-American exclusion. Well, between that San Francisco development and Levittown, there were these developments all over the country selling for about the same price. Well, today, as you know, those homes don't sell for that. They sell for $500,000 or more. The white families, working class families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the equity, from the appreciation they gained from the appreciation of their homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to finance perhaps medical emergencies, perhaps temporary unemployment. If you have savings you can draw on, you lose a job, you can survive for about a substantial reduction in your living standards for a while until you find a new one. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who were prohibited by federal policy from participating in this wealth-generating exercise gained none of that wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that about how the income gap was created. I don't have time today. I'll have to come back sometime to tell you about the income gap. But you'd think that if African American families had, on average, 60% of the incomes of whites, they'd have wealth about 60% of the wealth of whites. But in fact, African American household wealth is now about 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, whose effects remain today and have not been changed, not been challenged, not been addressed by a new civil rights movement. African Americans were prohibited by federal policy from participating in this wealth-generating exercise. And this wealth gap, you can add to the consequences of racial segregation that I described before, the achievement gap in schools, the health disparities, the mass incarceration, the political polarization, and the wealth gap. Well, I said before that you're facing the same problem that Paul Douglas faced 70 years ago, and you are. We have affordable housing programs today. The low-income housing tax credit is probably the biggest one. We can either fight to place those projects in higher opportunity communities. Communities are not already low income and segregated. And the chances are, if we fight, we might build one or two, but we won't get to build very much housing. We won't address the housing crisis. Or we can cave in to the demand that those projects be built in only low income, already segregated neighborhoods, and address the housing crisis by reinforcing segregation with all of the consequences that I just described. I'm not saying it's an easy choice, but I think that we should be thinking about maybe making a different choice than we made 70 years ago. The policies to redress segregation are well known. Housing experts know them, you know them. That's not the problem. We don't need more think tanks developing housing policies. What we need is a new civil rights movement that's going to engage not in litigation, not in think tank activity, but in the kind of direct action, mass action that we engaged in 60, 70 years ago to make the maintenance of segregation too uncomfortable for this society so that it doesn't persist. As I say, the policies are well known. I can go through a very few of them. I won't spend much time on them because that's not the problem. The problem is the lack of mass action that's going to prevent the implementation of these policies. But we should be abolishing zoning ordinances in white suburban communities that prohibit the construction of townhouses or low-level apartments or even single-family homes in many places on small lot sizes. We should, if you want an example of a constitutional remedy, given the description that I gave before about the unconstitutional way in which Levittown was created, and you can say the same thing for every one of these suburbs in the country, and you know this better than I do. If homes in Levittown now are selling for what, $500,000? And I think last time I checked, the African-American population of Levittown was maybe 3%, something like that. In a broader area around here, there's probably about 15% African-American, something like that. Well, the federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown as they come up for sale for $500,000 at market rates and reselling them to African-Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. Narrowly targeted for a specific constitutional violation. And if a court recognized the constitutional violation, you would have to uphold such a plan. We should be, the Treasury Department places a priority in placing low-income housing tax credit developments in already low-income neighborhoods. That's backwards. I'm not saying you shouldn't place some developments in those neighborhoods. People should have a choice of where to live. But the priority should be challenging the exclusivity of high-opportunity neighborhoods where people can lead more healthy lives. The same thing is true of the Section 8 voucher program, as you know. Most Section 8 vouchers are used in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation, partly because of the zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of apartments in higher opportunity places. So like I say, we know what to do. Not difficult. What's difficult is developing the new civil rights movement that's going to address this. I am working with a group of national civil rights leaders to try to create a new organization that's going to focus on residential segregation. I hope that it will come to being in the next year or two. And some of you have given me your business cards. I'll put you on the list to be notified when it does, and anybody else who wants to do so should let me know. But that's our challenge, and I hope you will participate in that challenge to redress this outrageous apartheid system that we have unconstitutionally created in this society. So thank you very much.
These are on. So Teresa and I are going to walk around and pick up any cards that you may have. Thank you. So I'll start with the first question since I have it in my hands. Looking at your suggestions, buying 11 homes for $500,000 and reselling to blacks at $100,000, how do you suggest that we stop the white flight that will take place?
Well, first of all, white flight takes place only because there are all white places to flee to. And if we were implementing this policy, I wasn't suggesting it does just be done in Levittown. If we were implementing this policy in all the places that we segregated unconstitutionally, the possibilities for flight wouldn't exist.
I want to take a moment, Richard, to also introduce you to, we have some of our, speaking of the work we need to do with government and elected officials, we have two tremendous leaders here today. Assemblywoman Darling is over in the corner here. And Assemblywoman Solage is right here. And we're also going to have, although not an elected official, but someone who holds us all accountable in the region, is Joy Brown from Newsday.
I have a question. Here it says, as a mortgage banker and realtor on Long Island, New York, New Jersey, how can I proceed with ensuring we actually move forward in making the change that is needed in relation to segregation now?
Well, certainly there's still ongoing discriminatory effects in mortgage lending practices. Credit scoring, for example, is done in a way that doesn't count ways in which African Americans typically gain good credit. For example, part-time repayment of rent, but emphasizes instead ways that more middle-class families gain good credit by making timely payments on their car leases. So that needs to be reformed. But basically, the problem today is primarily not mortgage policies, but the one I just described, and that is we created such a wealth gap that so many African American families who could maintain payments on a home don't have the down payment to purchase one. And we need public policies that can provide those down payments. I mean, the example I gave before is an extreme one in constitutional terms, but there are down payment assistance programs that many communities have developed under the present blind constitutional theories that the current Supreme Court uses. You can't specifically target African Americans for it, but disproportionately. I don't dance. Disproportionately than the ones who most need it as a result of our unconstitutional policies. So we should have down payment assistance subsidies for families. One presidential candidate has proposed that we give down payment assistance to families who have lived in traditionally segregated neighborhoods, and that's a good way of doing it without specifically saying it's for African Americans. So that's the main thing, and banks can, banks have a responsibility here because banks were responsible for creating this problem. They were required by government to do it, but they didn't object, and so they have a responsibility to help address this as well.
Okay. As a white thinker and leader, do you find it difficult to fully engage in dialogue about racial change?
Well, I'm an American citizen. This is a problem that faces all of us as American citizens. This is not a white problem. No, this is not a black problem. This is a white problem, as well as a black problem, as well as everybody's problem. And if we take our responsibilities as American citizens seriously, we all have to step up and do something about this.
Right. And this one is about allies and foes. And I do want to shout out my city team here, because I actually received my hard copy of your book from one of my city team members, Jasmine Thompson. So I thank you very much. And this question is about allies. Have you found any unsuspected or surprising allies or foes of your research?
Well, I'm not a professional historian. I'm just a ne'er-do-well. I don't have any training, but I am fairly proud of the fact that this book has been out now for 2.5 years, and not a single fact has been challenged by any professional historian. So, nobody is challenging the factual history, the constitutional history that I've described. We are in a period now in American history. It's very frightening, as I said before. We have the rise of white supremacy, or at least the exposure of white supremacy that's being stimulated by the President of the United States. But we also have a more passionate and accurate and engaged conversation about our racial history, about the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow we've never had before in American history. I couldn't get this book published originally. It came out 2.5 years ago. It would have come out before then if I could find anybody to publish it. Because at the time, maybe you recall, we were a post-racial society. Remember that? Nobody wanted to publish this book. It was, nobody's interested in this kind of stuff anymore. That's old stuff. Well, we're no longer in a post-racial society, and it's not just the stunning reception of my book. so surprising. That's a minor part of it. There are, Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, in his museum, and the African American Museum in the History Museum in Washington. The work of Ta-Nehisi Coates and the Black Lives Matter movement and the white elected Southern politicians who are running around the South demolishing statues that commemorate slavery. Unheard of. I wrote this book trying to get it published. So I think, allies, I think we're beginning to have the beginnings of the possibility of a civil rights movement. We don't have it yet, but I think we're having the kind of national conversation that's necessary to stimulate it. I'm trying to do what little I can to try to help stimulate that conversation. Otherwise, I wouldn't be spending the 8th decade of my life running around the country giving talks like this. I'd be home with my grandchildren. So I'm confident that we can get to that point where we have a civil rights movement in this country.
What are your thoughts on a housing guarantee? Would that be too much of a universal approach?
No, it would not be, but I want to keep emphasizing it again and again. We don't need more policy ideas. That's a great idea. What we need is a movement that's going to demand them, because there's no political support for such ideas. We should have a housing guarantee. The fact is that the private sector is incapable of providing housing for working and middle-class people, much less for poor people. Even for poor people, the low-income housing tax credit, and some of you may be involved in it, and you'll forgive me, but it's a very inefficient way of building housing for low-income families. We should be going back to the public housing concept that we had 80 years ago, and be building mixed-income housing with public funds, because that's the only way we're going to solve this crisis. But we're not in a position to do that now because there's no political support for it. So the first step is we have to figure out how to mobilize, I'm repeating myself, a new civil rights movement to demand it. We have no shortage of good ideas.
So this next one is on mobilization, because we also have millennials that work with us today to make sure we got more millennials in the room, because very often we're talking to each other. And so I do want to shout out the young professionals, minority millennials in shades of Long Island that are here. Just stand up and wave, because this is our next generation that we need to help support this new civil rights movement. So do you have tips for them?
No. No, I'm going to follow their lead.
Can you talk about how the real estate industry benefited from the public policies that encourage segregated housing or neighborhoods?
Well, yeah, and I want to say one thing first. When we talk about de facto segregation, one of the things we frequently say is that real estate agents were acting in the private economy. Well, they are private actors, but real estate is one of the most heavily regulated industries in this country. Every real estate broker and agent needs to take tests regularly. They need to take courses. They need to stay up to date on their obligations. In the 20th century, in the period that I was describing before, the National Association of Real Estate Brokers had a code of ethics in which it prohibited real estate agents from selling homes in white neighborhoods to African American families. That was the code of ethics of the real estate industry. And every state licensing agency that licensed a broker or his agents who subscribed to that code of ethics, and they were all required to do so, every state licensing agency was committing a civil rights violation when it did so. So this is not really private action. I'm not suggesting that everybody who's regulated by the government is a government actor. Right? That would be ridiculous. But nothing is more regulated than real estate. And so, yes, real estate agents contributed to that. As I said before, describing William Levitt, on his own, he would have been a bigot. He was a bigot, but he was required to be a bigot by the federal government. And the same thing is true of real estate agents and state governments. They all have a responsibility. There are real estate agents, agencies today that are the descendants of agencies that exist in this period, and they have a responsibility to contribute to this.
So this one is about, we spoke of disparities of income, and as a result, housing segregation has made a snowball effect. What's your opinion on reparations?
Well, I don't use the term reparations because most people misunderstand it, and I'm interested in saying things that don't create misunderstandings. Most people think of reparations as a single monetary payment to the current generation, which inevitably would be too small to solve this problem, and it can't be solved in a single generation anyway, no matter how large it was. So am I in favor of expenditures, public expenditures to solve this problem? Yes. If we were subsidizing, to use the example I gave before, if we were providing down payment assistance or subsidizing African Americans to buy homes in neighborhoods from which they were unconstitutionally excluded, that would be expensive. We should do it. But there are many, many other things we should be doing that don't involve money at all. And if we think of reparations as a monetary payment, we're not thinking of the very important things we need to do, like, for example, prohibiting exclusionary zoning ordinances, that I mentioned before. If we required suburbs to create and to have, well, New Jersey has a plan, requires a fair share of the low-income population of every metropolitan area. Every suburb has to provide housing and make housing possible for a fair share of its metropolitan area's low-income population. That kind of a rule wouldn't cost anything, but it's essential. So there are many, many policies we should be following, some of which will cost money, others of which will not. Remedies to racial segregation is much broader than reparations.
So there was a survey taken recently on Long Island in regards to millennials, and within this survey, the sample consisted of mainly white residents. And the survey asked where would they like to live, in diverse communities or in areas where mostly everyone looked like them. The latter response received over 50% of primarily white respondents. How do we combat that and get Caucasian Americans to want and embrace diversity?
Well, we have the kinds of national conversations that I talked about, but more important, policy creates attitudes. It's not just attitudes that create policy. You mentioned white flight before. Why did we have so much white flight in the mid-20th century? Well, partly it was because, and I'm not saying entirely, because we have a legacy of slavery that we've never addressed. We have a caste system that was created. We have created stereotypes of African Americans in this country that are demeaning and degrading. So I'm not denying that. But it's also the case that when we concentrated African Americans in single neighborhoods of disadvantage, without access to jobs, where they were overcrowded, where people were paying more rent than they would have paid for identical apartments in non-segregated neighborhoods, when people were doubled and tripled up with relatives and therefore were overflowing into the streets, where cities like New York failed to provide adequate services of the kind they were providing to white neighborhoods, those neighborhoods became slums. And white families looked at those neighborhoods and thought African Americans were slum dwellers. And if they moved into their communities would become slums as well. So the stereotypes that were created by policy is part of the stimulus to white flight. In the 20th century, I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk that there were hundreds of thousands of cases of mob violence where African Americans were driven out of homes in previously white neighborhoods. But there were also a number of many African Americans who succeeded in buying homes in the white neighborhoods that surrounded what we call the ghetto, and that's how the ghetto expanded. Well, when those black families succeeded, they maintained their homes in better condition than the whites. They were model citizens for several reasons. One is they wanted to make sure that they weren't being driven out or rousing opposition, but also because typically the black families who moved into those neighborhoods were wealthier than the white families who lived there, simply because their housing supply was so much shorter, they were willing to pay more for the same housing the whites were. So if we created a policy which really supported redress of segregation, part of the stereotypes that whites have would disappear. You know, it's a sickening cliche, but there are many whites who say that, and there are many bigoted whites who say, oh, well, one of my best friends is black. Well, there's a truth to that, and that is when people do have contact with one another, some of them, not all of them, but some of the stereotypes disappear.
So what do you say to those that believe that integration actually hindered the development of strong minority communities?
Well, I say that there are costs and benefits to do everything in life. And there is no doubt there are some sacrifices that have to be made if we really redress segregation. But there is no such thing as strong, healthy, segregated communities. There are things that people find attractive in them, and I respect that, and some people want to remain in them. But if communities were really strong and healthy, and we see this in uncontrolled gentrification, when black communities start to become healthier and stronger, others move in. So the notion that you can somehow really make a segregated community strong and healthy and keep everybody else but minorities out is a fancy. It can't happen. I mean, in an economy like ours, you can't prevent somebody, you know, a black homeowner, for example, from selling his or her home at a very high price to a non-black person who wants to buy it. So if we want to preserve all black communities, we have to keep them poor.
Interesting.
What are some of your suggestions to begin to address this legislatively on Long Island, i.e. inclusionary zoning?
I don't have any specific suggestions about Long Island, and I don't know enough detail about this community. You know, I'm telling a national story. Even though I grew up here, it's been a long time since I've lived here. So I don't have specific suggestions about Long Island. I do know that exclusionary zoning should, on a national basis, be prohibited. The federal government should pass a law prohibiting any community under the Fair Housing Act from maintaining a zoning ordinance that excludes residences of diverse residences, economic residences. That's a policy we should pursue because exclusionary zoning of the kind that you're referring to exists for the purpose of perpetuating an unconstitutionally created segregation. And a policy that perpetuates an unconstitutionally created policy is itself subject to challenge. But that's a generalization. I can't talk specifically about Long Island.
One of our local challenges is the development around these intermodal systems and transit-oriented developments that we're seeing on Long Island. And the idea is to keep our millennials here because we have flight. What's your opinion about this thing called affordable? Because when we look at that on Long Island, you know, some will say a $3,000 per month, one bedroom is affordable. But that's not keeping our millennials out. I'd love to hear your opinion on affordable.
Well, as I said earlier, the private sector is incapable in this economy of creating housing for moderate, working class, and low-income families. And we make a mistake in the housing policy world of thinking that the only problem is poor people. Poor people do have an affordable housing crisis, but so do working class and middle-income families. As I say, we need public sector activity to do this, and we have. We need more than a low-income housing tax credit. We need a moderate-income housing policy and a working-class and lower-middle-class housing policy. As I say, in my view, the private sector is incapable. It doesn't cost out. It doesn't price out, given the land costs, the housing costs that exist today, as well as the regulations that we've imposed, some of which are quite justified. It makes it impossible to construct housing that's affordable for most people. And so we need, housing should be a public good, and the public sector needs to contribute to it.
In your book, you talk about entitlements and the perception of those in public housing or receiving other sort of subsidies are getting these entitlements, but on the contrary, higher income earners, property owners, homeowners are getting entitlements as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, as you all know, we have a mortgage interest deduction in the federal tax code. I know it's been limited somewhat in wealthier areas like New York, but we still have it. It's a subsidy to single-family homeowners, disproportionately white, in housing. We have no such subsidy for low-income families or for moderate or working-class families who are renting their homes or who don't have incomes that are high enough to make tax deductions worthwhile. I mentioned before the Section 8 program, the subsidy to low-income families to rent apartments at market rates without paying more than 30% of their income in rents. Well, that's not entitlement. Every homeowner is entitled to take a mortgage interest deduction. If you are low income, you get a Section 8 voucher only as long as they're available, and then they run out. And if you're not high enough on the waiting list, you don't get it. It's not an entitlement. It's just an appropriation for a small number of vouchers. Only about a third of the families who are eligible for Section 8 vouchers get them. That's an outrageous inequality. An entitlement for the home-owning middle class and a waiting list for those at the lower end.
This is pertaining to the Shelby County versus Holder. Is Chief Justice Roberts woefully underinformed or disingenuous, in your opinion?
Say the last part again. Chief Justice Roberts what?
Is he woefully underinformed or disingenuous,
Oh.
in your opinion?
The courts follow public opinion. They have their own biases, as Chief Justice Roberts does. He's not uninformed. He knows this history I've been describing, and he certainly knows about voter suppression in terms of the Shelby case. But he's not under any public pressure to decide differently. I know we don't have much time, but real quickly, 1937, well, during the beginnings of the New Deal, the Supreme Court found every New Deal labor market reform unconstitutional. They said minimum wage laws were unconstitutional. They said child labor laws were unconstitutional. They said health and safety laws in workplaces were unconstitutional. That was their view. The 14th Amendment, they said, didn't exist to protect the rights of the freed slaves. It was done to exist to protect the rights of employers and property owners so that employers would have the right to bargain freely with their child laborers. Well, then Roosevelt won an overwhelming election in 1936, and he threatened to expand the Supreme Court so that it would begin to uphold some of his policies. And all of a sudden, the same justices said, well, maybe it's okay to have these kinds of laws. So the Supreme Court is not, as it pretends to be, some kind of Olympian institution that just looks at the Constitution. It's a political institution, and if we had a new civil rights movement, it would change its views, just as in Brown versus Board of Education, it changed its views.
How do we get more Americans to support targeted government policies that reverse racial discrimination when Americans, particularly whites, have been raised on the myth that what they have achieved has been without any government help?
Well, all I can say is we need a good job, as a new civil rights movement can do, of educating the American public, because people are open to change. People's views change. As I keep on going back, and as you know, I'm an old man. My experience was formed many, many years ago, but we changed people's views in the 1960s about race, and we can do it again. It's not impossible. I've worked with a group, and anybody who's in touch with high school teachers can get in touch with me, and I'll send this to you. I've worked with a group that's created a new high school curriculum that teaches the history that I described today. It's being used by high school teachers around the country, but it's still, we're still interested in distributing it to others. The high school textbooks that are presently used in schools lie about the history of race in this country, and so we need new curriculum. And if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than all of us have, they'll be in this poor position to remedy it as we've been. But one of the things we should do is begin to teach it differently in schools. And like I say, if anybody wants a copy of this curriculum, you should send me a note, and And Gwen, you can give everybody my email address, it's not
Absolutely.
secret, and I'll send it to you.
We would love it. We have over 130 districts here on Long Island, Richard, that to make sure that we got that into all of the districts here would be amazing. And along the lines of your comment about curriculum, we are also, as I was pointing to Tricia earlier in terms of our home ownership center, one of the things that we're doing is incorporating through our partnership with NeighborWorks and some other colleagues, a curriculum in home ownership, in the home ownership center that really looks at some of these historical components, but also addresses the issue of trauma in terms of how for generations, Black communities, African American communities, this has been suppressed. Can you just talk for a minute about, knowing your educational lens that you look through too, the impact of trauma as it relates to sort of moving out of where we currently are?
Well, again, I did write a recent report on toxic stress and the impact of it on children, particularly children who live in segregated neighborhoods where they experience more stress that becomes toxic, and toxic stress, as you know, from experiencing discrimination or violence or instability in homes, has hormonal effects that reduce cognitive ability. I can't go into the details of it now, but it's another part when I described at the very beginning of all the things that predict lower achievement. That's one of the effects of living in a segregated neighborhood that predicts lower achievement. And again, I'd be happy to send that report to anybody.
Thank you. This is my last question. Do you see signs of encouragement? And alternatively, what keeps you up most at night? What works?
Well, I'm very encouraged, as I said before. I think we have a more accurate and passionate discussion about race in this country than ever before in American history. I'm hopeful that it will continue and grow. I don't know, I'm not a worrier. What keeps me up at night is whether I'm going to make my next plane in the morning. But I am, as I say, I'm trying to do my part, and I hope all of you will do your parts to raise this country's consciousness about these issues and try to contribute to the motivation to fix it.
I'm going to try to wrap two questions into one because I want to be cognizant of time and give folks that may want to get one last book signed from you the opportunity to do so. So the demographics on Long Island have changed dramatically. Communities such as Hempstead and Roosevelt are now predominantly Latin American and not African American. And maybe you might have some thoughts on what those changes or trends have been driven by. Simultaneously, the question is, in fighting discrimination, we have the tendency to focus on color. Why not take Black or color out of the fight to only focus on social justice? Do you think it's possible to take color out of anti-discrimination fight overall?
I don't understand how you can fight for social justice without acknowledging the fact that the most serious affront to social justice in the history of this country has been slavery, the legacies of slavery, and its continuation in the Jim Crow period. That's the biggest affront to social justice in this country's history, and it's the thing that holds us back the most. So we need as I said, when I tried to get this book published, people said it was a post-racial society. And then what happened was a young man named Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, and we were no longer a post-racial society. He began to recognize some of the characteristics of the society. So I am not in favor of pretending that we can achieve social justice without acknowledging our obligation to redress the effects of our racial caste system.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
How about we join together and give Richard a round of applause?